Welcome to Swords and Hammers. Truth comes clothed in tales, and the soul remembers what the mind alone forgets. The world is loud, but for the next few minutes, it can wait. Take a moment, settle yourself. Listen well, and let us begin. The Signet and the Shadowfell. Gareth leaned on the rough timber palisade of Aethelgard, his knuckles white, his scarred hands gripping the wood until it groaned. He was old for a soldier. 40 long years he had served the High King. 40 years of forced marches, desperate defences, and the biting cold of the northern campaigns. He stared out past the fortress walls. Below lay the Shadowfell, a bruised twilight valley where the fog clung to the earth like a shroud. It was a land technically reclaimed. The king had broken the Tyrant's main army at the Battle of the Silent Plains. The victory had been absolute. The Tyrant chained, and yet the Shadowfell remained. The air here was thick, heavy with a malice that seeped into the bones and soured the spirit. The water tasted of ash, the crops withered, and the people in the valley, the ones the king had died to liberate, remained trapped in a nightmare of the tyrant's making. Gareth spat onto the ground. "The war is over," he muttered the words, bitter. Why then does it still feel like a siege? A horn blast cut through the gloom. A rider, moving fast, the banner of the High King snapping in the wind. Gareth pushed himself off the wall, joints protesting. He met the rider in the courtyard. The man, a young captain named Rhys, eyes bright with the arrogance of recent victories, dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. "Commander Gareth," Rhys said, breathless, "a decree from the capital." The king's final orders before his departure. Gareth's heart tightened. This was it then. The recall, the order to stand down. They would abandon Aethelgard, abandon the Shadowfell, and return to the light and warmth of the capital. He took the scroll. It was heavy, sealed with the great Signet, the image of the king triumphant over the dragon. Gareth broke the wax with a trembling thumb. He read. And as he read, the hope draining from his face was replaced by a cold, sobering dread. Rhys watched him, shifting impatiently. "Well, Commander, when do we march for home?" Gareth looked up, his eyes like flint. "We are not going home." He turned the scroll toward the young captain. "These are not orders for retreat, Captain. They are orders for advance." The courtyard fell silent. The small garrison of Aethelgard, men and women who bore the king's mark, had gathered. They looked from the scroll to the looming darkness of the Shadowfell. "Advance?" Rhys stammered. "Sir, the war is won. The king is victorious. Why send us into that graveyard?" Gareth held up the scroll. The authority in his voice was absolute. Not his own, but the king's. The one who issued this decree was the one through whom all things were made. The king does not offer suggestions. He issues decrees. And his decree is this: go. Go into all the world. Proclaim the terms of amnesty to every soul. He looked at his people. They were few. They were weary. It is the great paradox of the kingdom, that the king entrusts his greatest treasures to the most fragile vessels. "We have misunderstood our posting," Gareth continued. "A king who conquers a rebellious province doesn't then retreat. He sends forth his occupying force to enforce his terms of peace. Aethelgard is not a fortress to be held. It is a staging ground, a beachhead." He swept his arm toward the valley. "The king's claim is universal. There is not 1 square inch of the Shadowfell over which he does not declare, "Mine." We are not here to guard the border between the light and the dark. We are here to invade the dark. Rhys shook his head. Invade it with what? We are barely 50 strong. The Shadowfell is vast, and the Tyrant's poison is everywhere. We invade it, Gareth said, with the news of the Tyrant's defeat. We are heralds. A herald does not debate, he declares. We announce the fact. The king has come. The victory is won. But the people in the valley, interjected Ilara, the garrison's healer, they won't listen. They are broken, Gareth. They cling to the tyrant's lies. They fear the light. That is the nature of the disease, Gareth said, looking at the scroll again. The diagnosis is universally dire. They are not merely misguided. They are lost. They are not merely unwell. They are dead in their trespasses. The tyrant's greatest weapon was the despair he cultivated in the human heart. He made them believe the darkness was their natural state. He pointed to a stark line in the decree, the line that divided everything. Whoever believes the news, accepts the king's amnesty, and bears his mark through the waters shall be saved. Whoever refuses remains condemned. Gareth let the words hang in the air. They were heavy, terrible in their finality. To believe, Gareth explained, is not mere intellectual assent. It is the radical, total entrusting of the self to the king. It is the empty hand of the beggar receiving the free gift. And the mark, it is the soldier, publicly putting on the king's uniform. He looked at them sternly. This is why we go. Because the stakes are absolute. There is no middle ground. And those who refuse the amnesty do not do so out of ignorance. They do so out of rebellion. It is high treason against the king of the universe. It is the creature looking its creator in the face and saying, "I will not have you rule over me." The tragedy, Gareth realized, was not that the king condemned. The tragedy was that men and women, presented with the open door of the dungeon, preferred to remain inside. The very gates of hell are locked from the inside. That night, Gareth sat in the command tower, the decree spread out on the table before him. The tallow candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. He had rallied the troops with brave words. But alone in the quiet darkness, the impossibility of the task pressed down on him. To obey the command to go was to become a pilgrim, a traveler whose true citizenship was in the capital. This world was now foreign soil, hostile territory. "We are not just pilgrims," he murmured. "We are warriors on active duty." But how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you stab despair? How do you blockade fear? The Christian life is not a playground. It is a battleground. He traced the lines of the decree with his finger. His eyes fell upon a section he had glossed over earlier, a section detailing the provisions for the mission. "And these signs," he read aloud, "shall follow those who believe." He stopped. He had assumed these were metaphors, flowery language from the capital scribes. "In my name they shall cast out the tyrant's shadows. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall tread upon serpents and drink poison without harm. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Gareth stared at the words. "In my name." It was a phrase of legal authority, delegated power. An ambassador who speaks in the name of his king speaks with the authority of the entire kingdom. He realized his mistake, a profound, paralyzing mistake. He had been trying to fight the tyrant's darkness with his own meager strength, his own courage, his own steel. He had forgotten the name. The name of the High King, the name that carries the infinite weight of the Godhead, the name that shattered the gates of the abyss, the name that made the tyrant tremble. When a believer acts in the name, they are not asking their own will to be done. They are enforcing the King's will to be done on earth, as it is in heaven. These signs were not metaphors. They were weapons, the King's own arsenal, entrusted to his deputies, demonstrating the reversal of the fall and the restoration of rightful dominion. He looked at the challenges of the Shadowfell and saw them now through the lens of the King's provision. The spiritual oppression, the crushing despair. This was the work of the tyrant's lingering shadows. The decree promised authority over them. The power of the Saviour, liberating the captives. A liberation from isolation and confusion. The decree promised new tongues, a heavenly language of the Spirit that could pierce the fog and unite a scattered people. The power of the Sanctifier, the hostile environment, the poisoned water, the venomous creatures. The decree promised protection, dominion restored over a broken world, the authority of the coming King, and the sickness, the intrusion of death into creation. The decree promised healing, a declaration of conscious dominion, the power of the healer. Gareth stood up, a new energy surging through him. He had been acting like an orphan, struggling to survive, when he was, in fact, a deputy of the King, entrusted with the keys to the kingdom. "We have the authority," he barely whispered. "We just have to use it." At first light, Gareth assembled a patrol, not one for defense, but a sortie, an invasion party of 5. Gareth, Rhys, Ilara, and 2 seasoned scouts. They stood at the gate of Aethelgard. The Shadowfell awaited them, a silent, menacing presence. "How is this sustained, Commander?" Rhys asked, his youthful arrogance replaced by a sober realization of the danger. "How do we maintain the strength for this fight?" "Through communion, Captain," Gareth replied, tapping the signet ring on his hand. "The power for the mission is a direct consequence of the presence enjoyed in fellowship. We draw strength from the Commander, the shared life of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit." He looked at Rhys intently. "This communion is what transforms us. It is the source of our power, and it requires constant warfare against the sin within us that clouds our vision of His glory. Guard it well." He looked at his team. "Remember, we do not go in our own strength. We go in His name." He pushed the gate open. They stepped out of the relative safety of the fortress and into the twilight world. The air immediately changed. It was colder, heavier, a suffocating blanket of gloom that seemed to press in from all sides. They moved down the winding path toward the nearest village, a collection of dilapidated hovels huddled in the shadow of a jagged cliff. As they approached, a high-pitched shriek tore through the silence. A man rushed out of one of the hovels, his eyes wide with madness. He was screaming, a stream of incoherent curses, his body convulsing. Rhys drew his sword instinctively. "Witchcraft!" "No," Gareth said, recognizing the signs. "Oppression, the tyrant's shadow." A darkness seemed to gather around the man, a palpable presence of malice and fear. Gareth walked toward him, his movements deliberate. He felt the familiar knot of fear in his stomach, but he pushed it down, clinging to the promise of the decree. He stopped a few feet from the man. The darkness hissed at him, a sound felt, more than heard. "In the name of the High King," Gareth commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that surprised even himself, "the victor over the tyrant, the lord of this valley, I command you, release him." The man stiffened. The shrieking stopped abruptly. The darkness around him seemed to fracture, shattering like glass. He collapsed to the ground, weeping. But these were not tears of terror. They were tears of release, the liberation of captives. They continued on. The path led them through a narrow ravine where the water pooled, stagnant and foul. A serpent, thick as a man's arm, its scales the color of bruised flesh, slithered out from the rocks, blocking their path. One of the scouts raised his bow, but Gareth held up his hand. "The earth is the king's." He walked forward. The serpent coiled, ready to strike, but Gareth did not break stride. He stepped right over it, his boot passing harmlessly near its head. The creature hissed, then retreated into the rocks. Dominion restored. They reached the center of the village. The inhabitants gathered around them, their faces etched with suspicion and fear. They spoke a dialect Gareth barely recognized, a harsh, guttural tongue corrupted by the tyrant's influence. He began to speak the terms of the amnesty. He spoke of the king's victory, the offer of freedom. But his words fell flat. They stared at him blankly, unable to comprehend. The fog of the Shadowfell was too thick. Gareth closed his eyes, reaching deep within himself, into that place of communion. He prayed not for wisdom, but for the promised provision, the new tongue. When he opened his eyes, he began to speak again, but the words were not his own. They were words of fire and light, a language that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the heart. It was a language of pure worship, of absolute truth. The villagers gasped, their eyes widened. The suspicion melted away, replaced by a desperate, aching hope. They, for the first time, now understood. The blessing of the Spirit. Finally they brought their sick. A young boy, ravaged by fever, his skin pale and clammy. The touch of death was upon him. Ilara laid her hands on his forehead. She did not beg the king to heal. She acted with the confidence of a deputy imparting the king's will. Healing was purchased at the cross. "In the name of the High King," she said, "be made whole." The fever broke instantly. The color rushed back into the boy's cheeks. He opened his eyes and sat up, taking a deep, clear breath. The power of the healer. The village erupted, not in cheers but in worship. They fell to their knees, raising their hands toward the light that was breaking through the gloom of the Shadowfell. Gareth stood on the ridge, overlooking the village, watching the scene below. The sun had broken through the perpetual twilight, bathing the valley in a warm, golden light. The signs had followed, not as parlor tricks to impress the crowd, but as demonstrations of the king's power, tangible proof that the tyrant's reign was over and the king's reign had begun. He looked back toward Aethelgard. It seemed small now, a necessary starting point, but not the destination. He looked out at the vast expanse of the Shadowfell stretching before him. There were countless other villages, countless other souls trapped in the darkness. The commission had not been rescinded. The power had not been withdrawn. Gareth now understood the purpose of it all. The going, the preaching, the healing, the delivering. It was all for one ultimate end, that the king might be glorified. The greatest tragedy of the fall was not the ruin of man, but the dishonoring of the king. The great purpose of redemption is the restoration of God's glory in all creation. He turned away from Aethelgard and faced the wilderness. "Let us go then," he said, drawing a deep breath of the clean air. "In the authority of his name, until he returns." The name. Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Selah.